Good morning and welcome to Trip the Beltway Fantastic. Before we go any further, please, if you're watching on YouTube, please hit that button, subscribe to the channel, help us beat the algorithm. It really does make a difference. And remember, when you're out walking your dog or doing gardening or what have you, going to catch the bus, you can catch us on audio only format, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, or wherever you get your podcasts. I would so much appreciate it if you like us, subscribe, give us some stars, just to build our audience out a little bit. So let's get started. I am so very excited to have two of the most prolific writers on RS, the Responsible Statecraft, for which I am the editor in chief here today. They also happen to be our best European correspondents. Eldar Mamedov is a non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft and a member of the Pugwash Council on Science and World Affairs, a Nobel Peace Prize winning Track 2 diplomacy organization. He also served as a diplomat for Latvia back in 1994 all the way up to 2003, and also a consultant for the Progressive Party in the European Parliament. Thank you, Eldar, for being with us today. And also we have Ian Proud, who is also a non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute, and Director of Diplomatic Excellence Ltd. He was a member of His Majesty's Diplomatic Service for 24 years until 2023. He served in Thailand, Afghanistan, and Russia. He ran out his career there at the British Embassy in Moscow from 2014 to 2019. And upon his retirement, he published his memoir, A Misfit in Moscow, How British Diplomacy Failed in Russia. So thanks to both of you for being on the show today.
Pleasure being here.
Thanks, Kel. And can I just say again, I absolutely love your design and your whole kind of logo and animated thing. It's the best thing. It's the best thing on YouTube. Love it.
Oh, I love it. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. And in that spirit of fun and frivolity and tripping the Beltway fantastic, I am very much looking forward to talking to you about what's been going on with the relationship between Trump and Europe over the last few months during the Iran war. I think I'm understating it by saying that there is a yawning gulf between these two. It began in earnest after the 2025 inauguration, but it really exploded, no pun intended, after the U.S. and Israel attacked Iran on February 28th. Iran retaliated by shutting down the Strait of Hormuz, closed to all commercial traffic, particularly Western flagships and Israeli flagships or ships associated with either. Trump has made several entreaties for help to its NATO and European partners, but all major European nations have either closed their bases to the U.S. for operations, like Spain and Italy, or have restricted access only to defensive measures for their own assets in the region. One could say that the administration hasn't reacted very well to this. Let's check out Rubio recently in Cut 1, Chris.
In Europe, some countries in Europe, like Spain as an example, denied us the use of those bases for a very important contingency that in some ways the denial of those bases actually impeded the mission, not severely, but had a cost and in fact even created some unnecessary dangers. So if one of the main reasons why the U.S. is in NATO is the ability to have forces deployed in Europe that we could project to other contingencies, and now that's no longer the case, at least when it comes to some NATO members, that's a problem and it has to be examined. But ultimately, that's a decision for the president to make. His team and people like myself and others will provide him what those potential options are. But ultimately, he'll have to make that decision. He hasn't made those decisions yet.
And Trump, in his own indomitable fashion, was a little bit more to the point more recently in the White House. Let's look at Cut 2.
been of any help to us. And Spain has been horrible, absolutely horrible. You know, it's NATO. It's not even the fact that they're bad. It's one thing if they said nicely, or if they said, okay, we'll help, but the help's a little slow. But the level, and we helped them with Ukraine. You know, they made a mess out of Ukraine, a total mess. And we helped them with Ukraine. Ukraine has nothing to do, you know, we're an ocean apart. It has to do with them. It's like for them, it's their front door. We help them. And Biden gave them $350 billion, which was insane. It's one of the reasons the war went on. But when we needed them, they were not there. We have to remember that. And so if we ever have a big one, because we didn't need any help with Iran. We had Iran right from the first day it was over. It was over. And now it's even more so. We're so locked and loaded if we want to do. But we didn't need the help. And to a certain extent, I asked them, I didn't need the help, but I said, yeah, we'd love to have you help because I wanted to see if they do it.
Eldar, the president has spent the last year insulting Europeans, whether it be over Ukraine or Greenland. Then he launches this war without bringing any of our allies or partners on board, or at least giving them a heads up. Now he wants their help. Are you surprised that no one wanted to step up, one? And two, are you surprised at the president's reaction over the last several weeks?
No, I'm not surprised at either of those because the fact that no major European countries are rushing to join the US-Israel war of choice on Iran is not because they suddenly discovered the virtues of international law. Some certainly did, such as Spain, can be credited with consistent and coherent approach. But Germany, for example, let's not forget that the Chancellor Merz only last year was praising the US-Israel war as dirty work supposedly being done on behalf of Western democracies. And then when the war started this year, his first reaction was, it's not the time to lecture our allies on international law. Let's stand shoulder to them. He was foreseeing that the regime in Iran will be gone in weeks, in months, if not in weeks. So what happened, what changed the rhetoric at least, is that the war did not go according to plan, if there ever was one. So, and the downside of this adventure has become obvious to societies and the politicians in Europe in terms of rising energy prices, in terms of inflation, in terms of concerns about potential widening of the war, destabilization of a country of 90 plus million of people, with subsequent possible migration flows to Europe, especially to Germany. And the position of Merz, we're talking specifically about Germany, the biggest and the most powerful country in Europe, his position is politically very precarious. His approval ratings are tanking below 20%. So any such destabilization, economic, then migration and security related destabilization, would benefit the opposition, right-wing alternative for Germany party. So obviously it was in his interest to have this whole matter in Iran wrapped up rather expeditiously. And the same can be said about other leaders in Europe, such as Macron in France, Meloni in Italy, Starmer in UK, most everybody. But we should not mistake this sudden, skepticism and sudden conversion to international law and restraint with any sincere and consistent commitment to those concepts, excluding again a few exceptions like Spain, Sanchez.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two parts here. One, I would love to talk and ask Ian about this idea that Trump is demanding these European allies suddenly leap up, help him in a war that they didn't ask for, and not only that, invoke NATO obligations to do so. I know all three of us here are big critics of US foreign policy, and we're also big critics of European foreign policy. But I mean, could you talk a little bit first, Ian, about the irony of Trump insulting these European leaders all year? I mean, he's made them, he's belittled them. He's said in many ways that they aren't strong enough, that they're too dependent, that they are weak, that without us they would be nothing, and then turning to them and say, "Oh, we got into a war. You need to help us fix it."
Yeah, so on the first point in terms of Trump's style, that does appear unique to him, where you make demands and no negotiations. The USA just makes demands and expects people to roll over. But in some respects, his style isn't unique. I mean, the Europeans have been doing that with Russia since 2014. And so, generally speaking, and it isn't just a Trump issue; it's an issue across Europe. Generally, there's been a flight from diplomacy, and just making demands against your adversary is felt like it's enough, and clearly it isn't, because it doesn't work. As it relates to kind of U.S. demands, I mean, we got a war going on here too in Ukraine, and that's not Trump's war. I totally, get that, but it is happening, and actually that's taking up lots of our energy. And to the extent to which we have militaries, we want them to be positioned against this perceived, kind of Russian threat. So, we got a war going on here too. And for as much as people talk about NATO as a defensive alliance, NATO isn't just a launch pad for US military
Right.
adventures in the Middle East. We've been telling the Russians for years that NATO is a defensive alliance. We pose no threat. And yet here's Trump saying, well, we want to use NATO to attack other sovereign countries for no reason at all. It just doesn't work, I'm afraid. And Putin will be looking at that and be laughing at us, saying, what? NATO defensive alliance, okay, here we go.
Yeah, my favorite is when Trump wants to take things away because Europe is not helping. Like, he's a kid. He's like, he wants to take his toys and leave the sandbox. Let's look at, and I think it might be cut 3 of Friedrich Merz. Yes, can we check that one out, Chris?
Americans clearly have no strategy, and the problem with conflicts like this is always that you don't just have to go in, you also have to get out again. We saw that all too painfully in Afghanistan for 20 years. We saw it in Iraq.
Im Irak gesehen. Also, diese Geschichte ist.
So this whole affair is, as I said, ill-considered, to say the least.
Ich erkenne im Augenblick nicht, welche.
At the moment, I cannot see what strategic exit the Americans are now opting for, especially as the Iranians are obviously negotiating very skillfully, or rather, very skillfully not negotiating, and letting the Americans travel to Islamabad only to leave again without any results. An entire nation is being humiliated by the Iranian state leadership.
Well, I mean, you could pretty much hear Trump's head exploding all the way here in Washington to Berlin after Merz made those comments. And I know, Eldar, you referenced that a bit in your opening statement here regarding, Merz's flip-flop. He was all on board with being shoulder to shoulder with the United States when the war began, and now he's starting to dial things back when it's not going very good. But Trump reacted by ordering 5,000 US troops out of Germany. Now we have, I think, 36,000 there total. This isn't a huge number relative, but he also ordered some missiles out, like a missile detachment out as well, in a peak of anger. Eldar, can you talk a little bit about, this urge to punish our allies when they don't do what we want? And B, we could talk a little bit deeper on whether or not this might even open up maybe some positive change in the relationship between the United States and Europe. It just might not be the best way to go about it.
Well, Trump's actions are certainly mercurial and incoherent, and they undermine the credibility and trust among European allies. Now, you can certainly argue whether keeping American bases in Germany more than 80 years after the end of the World War II, whether that's a good thing or not, and probably some recalibration is way overdue. But the whole approach, the whole way this administration is dealing with the allies is simply counterproductive. It is creating mistrust. There's a perceived lack of predictability of what this administration can do next, and certainly, I think from U.S. point of view, this is not helpful because you do need allies, and it's simply not a way, to deal to manage the alliance. You can certainly argue that the alliance should change, it should be recalibrated, and all that. But this sort of impulsive back and forth, it's simply not helpful. Now, the second part of your question, when you asked whether that could have potentially positive effects on European strategic autonomy, there I would agree. And indeed, more and more you can hear from European thinkers and even policymakers that relying on a superpower which doesn't have clear, strategic direction and doesn't project confidence in its goals and its strategy, and certainly doesn't seek any consent or any buy-in from the nominal allies. That may be actually a healthy thing because that could prompt Europeans to finally think seriously about their own strategic autonomy. And by the way, when I mean strategic autonomy, I do not only mean it in the narrow sense of more rearmament of, building, more UAVs or missiles or intercontinental missiles. Not just rearmament. I'm also thinking in terms of diplomatic autonomy, and that necessarily uh, means finding ways to shut down the war in Ukraine, and that in turn is unthinkable without establishing some channels of communication with Moscow. And indeed, we see that there is a certain trend among European politicians, even those who cannot be deemed friends of Russia by any stretch of imagination, such as the president of Finland, Alexander Stubb, for example, they are talking now about the need to talk to Russia. Now, one, of course, can ask what has changed now in comparison, let's say, with the situation 4 years ago. Wasn't the imperative to talk to Moscow less relevant then than it is now? Just tens of thousands of more people have died meanwhile. But I would say it's better late than never. And certainly this whole situation with Trump and with unpredictability and perceived unreliability of the Atlantic link that could, by necessity, push Europeans into more strategically autonomous direction. And if this happens, then it's a positive outcome as far as I'm concerned.
Absolutely. We'll get to Ukraine in a second, but I wanted to talk to Ian because I think this is a question that a lot of Americans are wrestling with right now. Trump has asked, particularly the major powers, France, UK, Germany, to help open up the Strait of Hormuz. Now, you have a real good sense of the British Navy, what it can and what can't do. Can you talk a little bit about why these major powers do not want to help militarily to secure the strait, help open it up? Is it because politically they don't want to, or militarily they can't? Can you talk a little bit about that dynamic?
Well, I suppose the question is, can a military solution open up the Strait of Hormuz? With the collective might of the US Navy, which dwarfs, the French, the German, the British navies, they haven't been able to do it, on their own. And,
Right.
we can't match, the total US naval capabilities in theatre, right now. So the question is, even if we did help, would that actually unblock the Strait of Hormuz? And I think most military analysts would say no, it probably wouldn't, because if the US Navy hasn't been able to do it, then a few more ships from France, Germany, and the UK won't be able to do it either. So I mean that I think is a real point. In terms of capabilities, we just don't have any. And in any case, to go back to my previous point, we've got a war going on here too, and we're told about the Russian threat in the Atlantic. It took us 3 weeks to send one Type 45 destroyer to Cyprus, and that had to be fixed 2 times on the way. That's only just heading back towards the Strait of Hormuz, one Type 45 destroyer. So, we just don't have the capabilities. But in any case, is it going to work? And again, as with Ukraine, should we not be seeking a diplomatic solution to this rather than trying to kind of ratchet up a military operation that has never looked like it would succeed right from the first day?
Yeah. I do agree with you there. And I guess my thought is, when we're talking about Ukraine, let's get right into it. Headlines this week are saying that the Europeans are concerned that the very weapons that Trump promised to sell to Europe in the war with Ukraine aren't there, because we have used them all for our war of choice with Iran. We've been expending a lot of interceptor missiles for our defense of Israel over the last year. Trump made a big deal last year, and I know, Ian, you wrote about this, basically saying that the Europeans need to take their responsibility for the war in Ukraine. The United States is no longer going to fund it. Then he does this funny business with the Pearl program, in which the Europeans will pay the United States for weapons that we have in our stockpiles or through our US defense industry for the weapons they need to give to Ukraine. So we're still giving to Ukraine, but it's vis-a-vis Europe. Now Europe is saying, it looks like some of those weapons aren't going to be ready for us for another several years because of America's wars. Can you talk a little bit about the reality? Can Europe continue to fund this war in Ukraine? Can Ukraine continue to fight this war, given the realities of the collective arsenal
Yeah.
militarily?
Yeah. So, I mean, warfare on the horrible, gritty, body strewn battlefield now is being shaped by very cheap technology like drones, FPV drones, and that sort of thing. That is totally redrawing how combat works, on the front line. Uh, but actually, the kind of sophisticated tech, the strategic sort of weapons that could be used to escalate against Russia. These take months, years to build. They cost an absolute fortune. Once they run out, they still take a long time to kind of rebuild. You can't replenish the stocks as quickly. And when you're waging two big wars on two separate fronts, very obviously, I mean, maybe in the 20th century you could do that industrially, but you can't do it now. So there is that kind of massive capability issue, and also kind of how warfare is changing issue there. But in terms of funding, as I said, for a long time, wars are won by economies, not armies. And ultimately, I think Putin knows that eventually Europe is going to run out of money. I mean, the weapons will keep coming, but I mean, at some point the money will stop. And I think, they've given Ukraine another 90 billion. That will run out, in the spring of 2027. We're already deep into May, right? So if you're wondering why Europeans are now talking about sort of diplomacy with Russia for the first time in over 4 years, it's because they already know that come September, the Ukrainians are going to be doing their budget estimates for 2027. They're going to be saying, well, we're going to start needing to ask for money from Europe before Christmas, and the whole cycle is going to start again. And that's why I think the Europeans are now saying, well, yeah, we just don't have the money for this. We need to find a way out at last.
Yeah, exactly. We've only been talking about it for 4 years,
Well, yeah,
us
right.
three, on responsible statecraft and other platforms. Eldar, let's shift to Israel for a second here, because I know that you've written extensively about the EU and the European hypocrisy over war crimes, particularly those committed by Israel in Gaza and Lebanon, and comparing it to the rush to call out war crimes of Vladimir Putin in Ukraine. Do you get a sense now that the space has been opened by this latest war on Iran? Do you get a sense that Europeans are feeling a little bit more comfortable criticizing Israel? And I just want to play this one cut from Emmanuel Macron, recent comments that he made. Chris, can we go to cut 4?
Lebanon's fight today is just. It is to fight against all those who threaten its security or that of its neighbors. No one here justifies the attacks and terrorist movements, but the message is that Lebanon alone must manage its problems, and that nothing can justify actions that violate its territorial integrity and sovereignty. No occupation, no form of colonization, neither here nor in the West Bank nor anywhere else, can guarantee the security of anyone.
I mean, that's a direct criticism of Israel right there. I found that very clear, very straightforward. He got a big round of applause after that. Are you feeling like that there might be some movement on this issue, that the EU might finally be growing a spine when it comes to Israel?
Well, far too little and far too late is happening. Just this week, finally, the EU Council agreed on imposing some sanctions on extremist settlers on the West Bank. But frankly, this is inadequate. We're talking about a handful of people who probably are not traveling very often to Europe or at all. Most likely don't have any financial assets in Europe and not very much interested in either traveling to Europe or having those assets. So I think it's just some sort of symbolic action, a window dressing, a way of saying that, look, we are doing something, because really the outrage at what Israel is doing, not just in Palestine but also in broader Middle East, Lebanon, Iran, is growing. So the politicians feel the pressure, they feel the heat of the street in European countries, so they have to take some action. But this kind of action, frankly, looks more like a deflection to me than a really serious action. What they should have been doing is to suspend the EU-Israel Association Agreement, which provides significant benefits to Israel in terms of market access, and the European Union, let's not forget, is the main trade partner of Israel. Israel also has access to EU funds in terms of innovation, research, and some of these funds are allegedly being used for dual-use technologies, such as those that could be used for surveillance, repression, which normally is forbidden under the EU law. And the most unbelievable thing is that the EU itself, through its Foreign Action Service, European External Action Service, has conducted a review of Israel's compliance with the human rights clause of the dissociation agreement, and they have come to the conclusion that Israel is violating that clause, and the only consistent next step would have been to suspend that agreement, which was what, in fact, Spain, Ireland, and Slovenia have proposed for the EU Council, and that was rejected on the excuse that we need to keep critical and constructive dialogue with Israel. These are the words of German foreign minister, and one just wonders for how long are you just going to keep this critical and constructive dialogue when and all dialogue and no action when the evidence is mounting and is not ambiguous about Israeli war crimes in Palestine. And here again, the hypocrisy could not have been starker when you compare the reactions to Russian invasion of Ukraine. There, the EU, the first sanctions on the EU following the invasion were adopted at the end of February or just beginning of March of 2022, literally within the days of invasion. And that's fine, that's correct. But that contrast between swift action on Russia, Ukraine, and this, constant looking for excuses to postpone action on Israel or to dilute whatever action is finally being taken, that certainly strongly undermines the claims of the EU of, being defenders of
Right.
international law or international rules-based order.
Absolutely. And I do remember very clearly members of the Biden administration saying that, well, they can't answer whether what was going on in Gaza was a war crime. They're not lawyers, but they, like their European counterparts, rushed in front of cameras in February 2022 to declare war crimes were being committed by Vladimir Putin and Ukraine. A very, as you said, stark contrast. We're about out of time. Ian, I really want to pose this question to you as a former diplomat in the UK, major transatlantic power, also had worked within the embassy in Moscow, very familiar with NATO. I'm sure you've interacted quite deeply with the alliance and the organization. Do you think that NATO actually survives the Trump administration?
Sadly, yes, I do. Yeah, I served obviously alongside U.S. Marine Corps in Afghanistan as well in 2010. Had a U.S. Marine Corps lieutenant, as you say in the U.S., working for me and my team. So I mean, I think like the EU, like the UN, like NATO. I mean, the important thing is to remember that they are fundamentally bureaucracies. You know, we
Yes.
think of them as alliances, and of course they are military alliances, but they develop a life force of their own. Mark Rutte assumes the trappings of a head of government, you know, by virtue of being the civil servant effectively in charge of this bureaucracy. Now, all bureaucracies need to kind of get money, they need to gain new powers, they need to kind of grow to justify their existence. And it's only when you start to understand NATO in those terms do you realize that actually you're never going to wind it down because it just has this desire to kind of live. And I also think the idea that the US is going to pull out is also slightly far-fetched. Yes, Trump wants to kind of trim back US troops on the ground in Germany and things like that. But actually, let's be completely honest, US defense contractors make bucket loads of billions of dollars out of this kind of internal market for weapons that exists within the European NATO states. And we should never forget that.
Absolutely. And I personally am allergic to bureaucracies, and what you've just described is the military industrial complex in the United States, and it works hand in glove with NATO. I guess what I'm getting at is perhaps the spirit of NATO, and maybe some of the commitments may not survive, and maybe in regards to an actual debate happening in this country about the alliances and whether the alliance itself and some of these other alliances we have are still necessary. Are they rooted
Yeah.
in U.S. national interest. And I feel like perhaps in his own way, Trump is opening up space to have those debates. So if NATO does continue, it might be more back to basics, but I totally agree with you. It's hard to wind down that massive bureaucracy, and there are a lot of livelihoods. It's an entire industry associated with it, and people are going to be pretty committed to keeping their jobs
Yeah.
and the power and status that they have.
I mean, the one brief follow up, say, 'cause Elder may want to say something, is that, when have you ever recalled a truly whole of NATO military mission anywhere? Can you even name one? You probably can't, because one doesn't exist. So, I mean,
Yugoslavia or
I don't think that. I mean, when every single NATO country was involved,
yeah,
it would
right,
be
right.
hard to pick them. I mean, NATO is just an umbrella for basically U.S. foreign policy, and actually a bit of UK and every now and again a bit of European sort of foreign policy. That, and again, important to kind of bear that in mind, I think.
Well, Eldar, I feel like the folks in the EU would be very reticent to see NATO and all of the associated power and money and commitments dissipate after Trump.
No, certainly, certainly, and you appreciate a sense of panic in some European capitals, clearly, like in mine in Latvia, about the way the perception of NATO's reliability is changing, but that panic is not leading towards some necessary recalibration of the alliance and perhaps exploring ways for more European-centric security architecture. I mean, in some countries in Europe, that reflection perhaps is going on, such as Spain, but certainly not in my corner of Europe.
No. Well, thank you both for coming on the show. I consider you friends, and I appreciate all the work that you
Likewise.
do.
Feelings
And
mutual.
please, I want to, Eldar Mamedov, Ian Proud, two bylines that you need to search on responsible statecraft to get all of their work. They, like I said, they're prolific. They write all the time on current events and the most recent headlines, and I very much appreciate that as editor of Responsible Statecraft. And to the audience, thank you for joining us again. Please, if you're watching on YouTube, just give us a like and subscribe so we can build out our reach. And thank you, Chris, our producer in the background, for the wonderful graphics that we keep getting compliments for, and for keeping things humming along. And we will see you next week on Trip the Beltway Fantastic.